Hi, I'm Isabella and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk to you guys about how I got a 7 in high-level economics in the IB and how you can achieve the same thing. So the first thing that I want to talk about is content and how to best revise content. So the best way I think to figure out what you do know and what you don't know is to print off the IB syllabus. So you can get the syllabus from the website and it tells you all of the definitions and all of the equations and all of the things that you will need to know. I would recommend going through this and highlighting all the things that you don't know, even the things that you're slightly unsure about or just anything you're not 100% sure that you could describe in an essay format. I would definitely recommend going through all of these and making sure that you know what you're doing. After you've done this, there are a number of resources for learning content. So the first one is obviously from your textbook. I had the Oxford IB Economics second edition, and I definitely found it really useful to go through the book. I don't think their assessment tips are that useful, but I think that they explain the content in a really easy to understand, easily digestible way, and I just made handwritten notes from the textbook while I was studying for my exams. Another great resource would be YouTube. So my favorite YouTube explanation for IB Economics content would be Econ Plus Dal. I'll link his channel in the description below, but he makes really great, concise, and informative videos on basically all the topics in IB Economics. So anything that I didn't understand when I was studying for my exams, I just searched on YouTube on his channel for the topic that I was looking for, and he basically almost always had a video for what I didn't understand. Another great resource is if you just Google a list of IB definitions and equations. There are a lot of different sources online. I'll try to link some in the description below, but these are a really good way of making sure that you get those marks that you don't want to miss on the exams. So for example, the definitions section in paper 2, so the 2 markers at the beginning, or the definitions questions in paper 3, as well as defining economic terminology at the beginning of your essays on paper 1. Speaking of papers, past papers are a really great way to study for your exams. So something that people always suggest is to do as many past papers as possible. And while I agree that this is true, that you should try and do past papers when you can, I think that something people often forget to look at are the mark schemes. The mark schemes are a really great way of figuring out IB definitions and what the examiner wants to see from you. They're also a really great way of knowing what graphs are relevant to what questions, and they provide certain evaluation points that you might be able to use, particularly on paper 1 and paper 2. I would say that memorizing or just knowing what the examiner is looking for based on the mark scheme is actually more helpful than doing past papers for paper 1 and paper 2. The reason I think this is because paper 1 and paper 2 are essay-based questions, and so it's quite difficult because essays are quite subjective a lot of the time, and because it's your own work to check if you've written a good essay, whereas the mark schemes provide possible evaluation points and possible answers for what you could give for the question. So I would definitely recommend doing some past papers, especially for paper 3, because those are a little bit more straightforward since they happen to contain a lot of equations, calculations, and definitions. But I would say for paper 1 and paper 2, after you've done 2 or 3 past papers, it's more worth it to look through the mark schemes and see what they're looking for rather than just writing the same essays over and over again. Now on to specific tips for each paper. So I did HL economics, so some of these tips might not be as relevant if you do SL, but I still think that they're worth listening to and just figuring out which ones apply to you. For paper 1, I would recommend knowing theory of the firm inside out. A lot of people find this topic difficult, but once you know it, it's very straightforward and easy to understand and is a great tool to have for paper 1. This is because on the micro section of paper 1, there's always one question that's about theory of the firm. So if you understand theory of the firm completely, you don't have to worry about the other question that might come up, especially if the other question is very difficult. So personally, on the micro section, I would always choose the question that's to do with theory of the firm because you can easily prepare for it before the exam, since you know that a theory of the firm question is definitely going to come up. I'm not sure if the exams have changed since I did them, but looking at all past papers from the last 10 years, every single year, both in May and November, they had a theory of the firm question on the paper 1 HL paper. For both the micro and macro section, something that people tend to do is do things that waste their time. So the exam basically is at a length where you have to write the whole time. So here are some time-saving tips that I would recommend. Part A, you don't need to write that much. You don't need to do any evaluation or any analysis. What I would recommend is writing down the relevant definitions and then drawing the diagram that's relevant to the question. All you need to do in Part A is describe everything that's happening in the diagram. So describe where the graph originally was, describe the changes, describe why those changes have happened, etc. If you explain the graph in completely full detail, you really don't need to explain anything else in Part A for both micro and macro. Obviously, this is dependent on the question, so if the question doesn't require a graph, which is quite unusual in paper 1, then this advice wouldn't apply. But for every question that does involve a graph, as long as you explain fully everything that's happening in the diagram and why it's happening, that should be enough to get you full marks on Part A. Another time-saving tip would be to not repeat what you've said in Part A in your Part B. So as you probably know, Part B is about evaluating, and it's usually evaluating the topic that you already described in Part A. If you need to use the same diagram or the same definitions, if you need to use the same diagram or the same economic terminology that you've already used in Part A, you don't need to redraw the diagram or redefine any terms that you've already defined in Part A. Just reference back to the diagram by saying something like figure 1 drawn in Part A or the diagram drawn in Part A, etc. There's no point wasting your time drawing another diagram that you've already drawn. Another important thing to note in Part B of paper 1 is that it's much better to write about 2 or 3 evaluation points in great detail and explaining multiple perspectives on the topic than just listing a bunch of different evaluation points. That's not going to show an in-depth knowledge of the topic that you're writing on. So it's much better to have these in-depth evaluation points rather than just rambling about different things and not being able to show off your full knowledge of the topic. For paper 2, something that's really important to do is choose your question based on how well you can answer the 8 marker. By the time you do your exams, you should know the definitions basically off by heart. So you don't want to waste time by choosing something where you see the definitions at the beginning and you know how to answer them and then screw yourself over on the 8 marker. Remember that for the definitions in paper 2, you only need 1 sentence for each term you're going to define. And for the 4 markers, you really just need a diagram and then a 2-sentence description of that diagram. Similar to what we talked about in paper 1, for the 8 marker on paper 2, you should really only have 2 or 3 in-depth evaluation points and don't waste time, again, just talking about a lot of different things without going into great detail. Something that the mark scheme mentions for the 8 marker is to use the text and your own knowledge of economics in order to answer the question. Because of this, you should definitely use quotes from the text within your essay. So what I would personally do is, as soon as writing time starts, and also make sure to think about this during reading time, is to highlight in your text or underline the quotes that you're going to use within your essay. This really helps you keep focused on making sure that what you're writing in the 8 marker is relevant to the text, and also shows the examiner, who's probably reading lots of different essays, that you're able to use the text alongside your own economic knowledge. Final tip for paper 2 is that there are topics that come up really often for the 8 marker. These tend to be aid versus trade, trade versus protectionism, and market-based policies versus interventionist policies. Something that I would recommend doing before you go into your exams or when you're studying for your exams is to make a kind of mind map showing the comparisons between the two and making a kind of essay plan for if those questions ever come up. So for example, you could have a piece of paper and on one side write aid and on one side write trade, and then write 2 evaluation points for each, and know in your brain that if there's an aid versus trade question that comes up, you're always going to argue trade or you're always going to argue aid, and then just put in quotes and the relevant information that makes it relevant to the text. This is really helpful because you don't have to stress out about thinking, this is really helpful because you don't need to stress yourself out by thinking of new evaluation points every time you write the paper. In your mind, you already know what your standpoint is and you can already prepare evaluation points in advance. The last paper that you'll do if you do HL is paper 3. So paper 3 should be one of the easiest papers because you don't need to write a full essay and they tend to be short answer questions, so you can gain a lot of marks even if you miss one question. But people often trip up because they consider paper 3 to just be a math paper. So the problem with this is that people just memorize equations and how to calculate something but forget everything else they've learned for the last 2 years. Definition questions always come up on paper 3, so just like all the other papers, it's important to know your definitions for this. There's also explanation questions, and just like paper 1, there tends to always be a theory of the firm section that you can choose from because because on paper 3 you can choose to answer 2 of the 3 questions that are available to you. Again, if you know theory of the firm really well, I would recommend choosing that question on paper 3, and it means that you don't have to worry about remembering even more information about a different topic, especially if you also chose the theory of the firm question on paper 1. Paper 3 gives marks per sub question in the paper, and that's really useful because it tells you how long your answer should be. So for example, if the definition is 1 mark, then there's probably only one thing that you need to say about the term that you're defining. However, if you have a short answer question that has 4 marks, that means you usually need to have an explanation that includes 4 things. Paper 3 is something I would really recommend also doing past papers alongside looking at the mark schemes. And when you answer the questions and look at the mark schemes, make sure that you understand why an answer is worth 4 points or why it's worth 2 points. In the answer they give you in the mark scheme, see if you can see 4 different things that they're mentioning for a 4-mark question. Overall, there's no easy way to get a 7 in HL economics. It does tend to be a lot of content, and although a lot of it is common sense, there is a lot of memorization involved with things like definitions or equations. For memorization, I would just say to practice as much as possible, whether that's through flashcards or through doing past papers or by asking friends or family to quiz you. If you want even more practice for how to write a good evaluative essay, I would recommend engaging in a casual debate with one of your classmates or friends who also takes economics so that you can see the different evaluation points and know how to present different perspectives in your essay. Economics is one of those IB subjects where if you really put your full effort in, it's definitely possible to get a 7, no matter how good your teacher is or what textbook you're using. There are a lot of resources available online, and I hope that these tips have helped you and make you feel a little bit less worried about taking your exam. I know that for May, IB exams are canceled, but I still wanted to upload this video for anyone who might be considering taking their exams in November, or for anyone in the future who might be worried about taking their economics exam. So for anyone who might be just finishing their first year of IB now. I hope these tips have helped you, and feel free to leave any questions in the comments below. Bye!